All right. Well, welcome back to the Chaplain's College School of Ministry, Old Testament Survey 3. This is going to be the books of the writing. And we're going to be in Lesson 5. We're going to be looking at the books of Daniel and Lamentations. Looking at our lesson outline, we can see where we are. We're about halfway through at this point. Everybody going, yay! This is the period of the exile, Daniel and Lamentations. Lesson 4, the writings about women, Ruth and Esther. That just actually got up recently, so that should be there. Went up sometime this morning. And so that's where we are at the moment. So let's get started into this. Just a brief overview for the two books. Both of these books are set during the time of the exile. Daniel was written in Babylon, and Lamentations was written from Jerusalem. And Daniel covers a lot larger period of time than Lamentations. Lamentations, probably just a few years when Jeremiah was in Jerusalem before he ended up having to take a run off to Egypt. Whereas Daniel, it's probably around 70 years worth of time. And all that was spent, within the Babylonian Empire. Jumping right into Daniel. Daniel is a prophetic and apocalyptic book, very similar to the book of Revelation in the New Testament. Daniel himself was taken early in the exile period. He was in the first period when the Babylonians first came down and made their first conquest. They hauled him off. Then there were several, two others before they finally completely conquered Jerusalem. And each time they would bring more prisoners up to Babylon. But he was in the first batch that went up there. But because he was bright and all that, and they recognized that as one of the things that Babylon did, is they would incorporate the people that they conquered into their system, which helped them, of course, control them a little bit better. Pretty good strategy when you think about it for a conquering nation, rather than just completely keeping them under thumb. You get them involved, get some, a little bit less chance to complain about things. But he was brought into a high office, in the government. And while he was there, he served under 3 different kings from 2 different empires. We're from Babylon and from the Medo-Persian Empire. And as I said, it covers about 70 years in this thing. I need to get something else here that I was looking for. Okay. Yeah. Oh, it was the Medes and the Persians. So that's just kind of a way of, they link the two together and they just call it the Medo-Persian Empire. But it was an association between the Medes, a group called the Medes, and a group, like two countries basically. One was for the Medes and the other was the Persians. Persians you'll still hear a lot about today because most Iranians will claim that they're Persian. Because they like to look back to the glory days, as it were. And as we look through Daniel, we find out he was about 15 years old, probably when he was carried away. And as we look towards the end of the chapter, we see he's probably in his 80s by that time. Obviously, if it was about 70 years, 70 plus 15, that's going to put him at about 85 by the time the thing's over. So now we start looking at these 3 kings that he served under. The first was Nebuchadnezzar. Sure, a lot of people have heard that one. That's a big name that you hear everywhere when they talk about Babylon. He was the big conqueror of everything. And one of the parts that was under him when Daniel was working under Nebuchadnezzar, that first brought him to his attention actually was Nebuchadnezzar had this dream and his own people couldn't figure out what it was. Now Nebuchadnezzar being a rather shrewd guy. He wasn't going to tell them what the dream was so that they could take hints off of that. He just said, hey, if you guys are so as good as you claim to be, you tell me what my dream was. And none of them could do it. But then somebody had heard about Daniel, and they said, oh, let's get this guy up here. So Daniel came up, and he said, give me a little moment to pray. So he took a little time off to pray. God revealed the dream to him, and then he came up and interpreted it for Nebuchadnezzar. And this was this dream that he had about, the image with the 4 parts. The 4 parts were made out of gold, silver, bronze, and iron. So as he explained it, the gold represented Babylon, which was Nebuchadnezzar's empire. The silver was the Medo-Persian, which was going to follow on to Babylon. Bronze represented Greece, which of course conquered the Medo-Persians. And then the iron represented Rome. And then there's a part at the end about iron and mixed with clay, which were down at the toes. And that's a part that's going to be yet to be fulfilled. That was like this future thing that we'll see coming up, like in Revelation, where it's like the rebirth of Rome is what they're kind of referring to there, with all these 10 little extra countries that are associated. But now one thing you look at here, if you look at each of these metals, starting from the top, because the head was made out of gold and then went down to the chest, and then down to, to the thighs and then to the legs and all that. And but each successive metal is a little bit stronger than the previous one. And they're also just a little bit less shiny. So gold is fairly soft metal. That's why it's easily worked for jewelry, for one thing. Also doesn't tarnish. Silver, a little bit stronger. Bronze, it's a nice alloy. So it's fairly strong. And then you get to iron, which is really strong. When they started making the iron weapons during this period of, various times through here, that's when, the Bronze Age weapons were completely outclassed. And that's what part of the way a lot of these were able to do some of their conquering. It's also kind of interesting, when they talk about Rome being represented by the iron. Of course, a lot of their troops had iron armor that they were wearing. Their breastplates were iron, a lot of them, and a lot of their weapons were iron. And then when we get to that last bunch there, with the revived Rome, which is yet in the future, and these other little 10 associates, it's iron mixed with clay. So you've got kind of you start seeing the rebirth of the strength of Rome, because as you go through this, each one conquered a little bit more area, and in the process took over, conquered the one preceding it. So the Medes and the Persians conquered Babylon and took a little bit more area. The Greeks conquered the Medes and the Persians and then expanded their territory. And then Rome took over the whole batch and continued on, for basically the whole known world at the time. So in this next batch, this one that's yet to be seen, that you see the iron, which is like the strength of that Rome represented back at that time, is going to come forth. But because of the clay being in there, that kind of binding all these things together, that crumbles easy. And so it's alluding to the fact that this association is going to crumble. Of course, that's going to crumble when Christ comes down and takes care of the whole thing. But that's, just the way that they're showing the the relationship between these different empires. Okay, then next thing we see that Daniel did with Nebuchadnezzar was Nebuchadnezzar got kind of full of himself, decided he was going to build this great big statue to himself, about 90 feet tall. Apparently that's, in fact, we could probably go outside here and look and guess about how big that is, because they're saying it's about the size of the palm trees that were in that area. Some of these big king palms, which we see a lot around here in our area, these big tall palm trees. So that was a pretty good sized statue he built of himself. And he was requiring everybody, of course, to bow down and worship it. And this is where you get the story of these 3 other Hebrew guys that Daniel had actually, helped get into this position of being part of the government. You Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were out there and they were told, okay, you've got to bow down to this statue. And they go, no, we're not going to. No way. We're only bow down, to the true God. Nebuchadnezzar, went ballistic, got rather agitated and said, crank up the heat, and ordered them thrown in. Well, this furnace was so hot that actually the guards that threw them in were actually incinerated. Not a good job to have at that point, I guess, being a guard for Nebuchadnezzar. You could get yourself into some bad situations. But to Nebuchadnezzar's amazement, when he looked in there, he saw the three of them walking around, and then he saw a fourth figure walking around in there. And he's like, what the heck is going on? He couldn't figure this out at all, but then he finally made the statement, that he said that the fourth one appears, like the son of the gods. So he finally just, said, okay, you guys come on out. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came on out. And the amazing thing is that there was no mark on them from being in that fire. The only thing that was gone was the ropes that had been binding them. No mark on them. Their clothes were still perfect. And it said they didn't even smell like smoke. That's amazing. So that really kind of shook Nebuchadnezzar to his core, and he put out a declaration saying that nobody should be saying anything bad about the God that these three guys worship, because this God's got some power. I don't think he was still convinced that he was the only one, but he said, this is not a God that I think I want to mess with. So he put out a decree that's saying, nobody should be saying anything bad about the God of the Hebrews. Now we get to the second king, which was Belshazzar. He was actually the son of Nebuchadnezzar. When you get down to this part of it, you'll find out that he was having a rather major party for a lot of his friends and other royals and trying to put on a big impression, so he decided he'd bring out the good stuff to be drinking their wine and all that from. But what he brought out was all the gold and silver vessels that had been plundered from the temple in Jerusalem. And while they were drinking from these, they were making all sorts of comments about other gods, and the god of silver and the god of gold and wine, and saying disparaging things about the fact that oh, look what we took these from from these Hebrews, and that's that's when, as they say, the writing was on the wall, literally. The hand appeared and wrote these words, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upsarin. Now, out of your book, that little section there in the middle, that's straight out of your text, because it's pretty well describes things. So the Mene means God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. The Tekel means you have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. And then Perez, which that Upsartan I think is derived from, says your kingdom has been divided. Yeah.
What language is that?
I'm not quite sure. I didn't see it mentioned. I'd have to look that up and find out.
The Perez is the same thing as Sharson?
Yeah.
They're the same word.
It's like I think it must be the base word from it.
Okay.
So, one of the things while they were having this big party was, the Medes and the Persians actually had been out, attacking. But these guys were, safe, they thought, in their nice little fortress city there that had these really super thick and high walls. So they really didn't care. They figured nobody's going to get through those walls. So, Belshazzar was really counting and depending and putting his faith in those walls. Well, the story goes that the Mede and the Persian commanders noticed that, the river runs right through there, and it runs under the walls. So they decided to go out and just divert the flow of the river. So once they did that, the water level went down. They could go right under the walls in the dry bed. And that's how they got in. So the very night that they were having this big party is when they came through under the walls and Belshazzar was killed, just like it said on the wall there. So it didn't take long for that one to come to pass. Then we get now to the third king that he served under, and this was Darius the Mede. He was actually the first ruler of this Medo-Persian Empire after they conquered Babylon. It's possible that the word Darius might be more of a title than an actual name, because apparently it's used in several other contexts to indicate leaders. So it's possible that the real name of this guy was Cyrus, which we've heard about before. Cyrus the Mede. So it might be one and the same. Yeah, this is when we started with the return of the Jews back to Jerusalem. So this is like 70 years after the initial exile. So we've gone through quite a bit of history by the time we get to here. But now Darius was tricked by some of his associates into putting out a decree that's saying, hey, for 30 days, you're not allowed to worship anybody. Well,
Darius worshipped other gods, though.
yeah.
So he was told he couldn't worship the gods that he wanted to worship.
Well, Darius put out basically saying you're not allowed to worship anybody else. Darius was the king, so he just put out this edict saying, you can't worship anybody else during this time.
Oh, everybody else can't worship it. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Okay.
So Daniel, he didn't go along with that. He didn't change his routine. He always had this routine of going up to his room and praying at about the same time. So he didn't bother to change that. He wasn't going to listen to that rule. He wasn't going to say, have somebody else telling him he couldn't worship God. Well, these guys that got Darius to put out this edict in the first place, the whole idea was to get Daniel out of the way because they wanted to move up. So they were out hanging around outside his window, and as soon as they heard him starting to worship, they went off and said, hey, Darius, guess what? He's breaking your law. He's breaking your law. So, unfortunately, because of the way that the Persian law is set up, this was also mentioned, in the book, in the study about Esther. But because the way it's set up, once the king issues a decree, it can't be changed. Even the king can't change his own decree. So Darius was rather upset about this whole thing, but he didn't have a whole lot of choice, so he had to go through with what the sentence was, which was throw Daniel in the lion's den. So they put him in there. He was not real happy, but he had to go and do it. So the next morning, he goes down there, and there's Daniel still standing there. God had managed to shut the mouths of the lions. Not a scratch on Daniel. So he ordered Daniel removed from the lion's den. And immediately then he said, okay, all you guys that accused him, you go into the lion's den and take your whole family with you. And the scriptures say that they basically didn't hit the bottom of the den before the lions were on them and had really just shredded them. It was rather quick judgment there. And then Darius issued an edict similar to that Nebuchadnezzar had said about, hey, don't say anything bad against this God, that Daniel worships, because again, he recognized this God's got some power. Again, he wasn't quite ready to say, I'm going to fully believe in him, but he recognized that this is a God that's got power. Yeah.
This has nothing to do with this. It just brought a thought about Albert. Even though Darius didn't believe in God, he acknowledged that there must be a God because he saw it in the example of Daniel being protected. when you were talking about your dad, and your dad, kind of, well, that, it's okay for you. I'm telling you, that's what's going to bring your dad to the Lord. And you're like Daniel. You're sticking true to your God. You're an example. And your dad already kind of has acknowledged that, well, hey, that's kind of working for you, right? So he's going to figure out that God's going to work for him too. I'm sorry. Sorry about you online classmates. Thank you.
No, I'm sure I'm sure they like to hear you guys talking about things and bringing up points when something like that, hits you. That bring it up. That's great. That's the whole idea of why we're meeting together, so we can interact when something like that comes up. I'd like to get more of that going on, actually. Okay, so the next part we're going to look at in Daniel is some of the visions that he had. He had basically 4 fairly major visions. The first one was these 4 beasts. And again, we have these beasts then representing the different empires. You've got, like a lion with eagle's wings. That was Babylon. Again, this chart is straight out of your text there because it gives a good description. There was like a bear. That was the Medo-Persians again. A leopard represented Greece. And then there was this 4th beast that was not really anything that anybody could recognize. It was just plain nasty. But it wasn't any recognizable existing animal. And that was Rome. And as it said here, it was very different from all the others. And then it had 10 horns. Now, some interesting things to look at here. When you look at, a lion with eagle's wings representing Babylon, well, the main palace there, guarding their entrance, were winged lions. So it ties right in. It's like, their own decoration gave them that one. The bear, Medo-Persia, it had three ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and that was to symbolize the countries that they'd conquered. The leopard for Greece, that's because Alexander, when he came in, was very swift in his conquests. Just like a leopard runs very fast, Alexander was really quick in his conquests. When the Greeks conquered then the Medo-Persians and then took over the other parts of the world. And then there's Rome, the big boys, the bad guys. They were the most powerful of this bunch. They had the most territory, and they just was quite like any beast you could even imagine up to that point in time. Rome had kind of this good and bad side. You hear about the Pax Romana, which is the peace of Rome, because there was quite a while there when Rome was in charge that there was a fairly good amount of peace in the world. But the reason was because they were so heavy-handed putting things down that nobody dared do anything to oppose them. They were not afraid of throwing their force around. And they were very, very good at it until they got polluted by some other problems.
At the end of the scripture, it says it was different from all of the other beasts before it. Does that mean it was different in power? I mean, it was bigger, it was larger? Or
I guess just the way it appeared, it was completely different looking. There wasn't anything you couldn't say, it looked like a lion, or it looked like a bear, or it looked like a leopard. It just was something that nothing like they'd never seen. It had these 10 horns, and
okay, because like you said, the one like a bear from Medo-Persia, that symbolizes the countries that they had conquered.
Right.
I'm not understanding the 4th beast, what that symbolism is supposed
It's basically that it was just so different from any others that there's really nothing to compare. Yeah, just nothing to compare them to, because they, like we said earlier, Rome essentially conquered the known world at the time around the Mediterranean. They were up, they'd gone clear up into England, into Germany. I visited Germany a long time ago. And one of the first places I went was a Roman fort, and it was close to the line that they had actually built right there to separate them from the Germanic tribes. There was a full Roman fort there in Germany that they had partially restored. So they were everywhere. Okay, the next vision out of these four is this ram and the goat. Another kind of interesting one. Now he's, going a little bit later saying, okay, the ram was the Medo-Persians, and then there was this male goat, which was Greece. And then there was the one-horned male goat. That was representing the first king of the Greeks, which was Alexander. He was the great conqueror among the Greeks. And then you get the broken horn. That represents, after Alexander died, he died fairly young. There was really nobody that could replace him as far as leading the Greek Empire at the time. And so it broke into a lot of different little, things that were kind of fighting among each other for power. So that's what the one with the broken horn represents them: Macedonia, Syria, Egypt, Asia Minor.
So they had like little civil wars.
Yeah. They were constantly fighting among themselves. And then the little horn was a later king, Antiochus Epiphanes, who was a pretty nasty guy in his own way in some ways. He's the one that desecrated the temple. He came along and said, okay, I don't like what you guys are doing down here. You're trying to oppose me. This is about the time of the Maccabee rebellion was getting started. So he said, I'm just going to say you guys can't do any worship at all in your temples. And then he sent somebody in there to go in and desecrate the temple, which they did by pouring basically, pig broth on the temple, on the altar, and putting in other, statues of other gods and etc. So as you see on here, basically, Antiochus Epiphanes, he got into a few battles, but that was the time that the Maccabees then kind of restored temporarily some order into Jerusalem for the Jews. And that's actually where Hanukkah is derived from, that time of history. Because right around Christmas time is, it was Hanukkah for the Jewish holiday. And if we look at there's four kingdoms that were divided, you might see references to the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. That was kind of the general description, groups of them that we're going against. We'll see that more when we get into another one of the visions here later. But just kind of keep that in mind. Let me get into the famous 70 weeks. Now, this is a place where probably we could spend like 2 or 3 full semesters just trying to decipher this one. But since we got to keep it at kind of the high level here, the 30,000 foot view, we'll go through it. But basically, this one, he said there's these 70 weeks, which we find out represent 70 years. Or 70 years of weeks or whatever. So again, this little graphic is straight out of your textbook there. Nice little summary. But the important part of this whole thing is that for the 69 weeks that we can account for, if you figure that out and do all the math, it's kind of shown there on the right side of that graphic. Okay, 69 weeks times 7 years per week, you get 483 years, 360 days per year. That's the lunar calendar, not our 365 days per year. But that's 360 on the lunar calendar. Gives you 173,880 days. And then if you look at the timing of things, 173,880 days after the order to restore and rebuild the temple turns out to be the 10th of Nisan, which is one of the Jewish months, in AD 33. That's the day that Jesus entered Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. So Daniel predicted this down to the day. And then that Friday, which was the 14th of Nisan in AD 33, that's when Christ is crucified or cut off. because the prophecy said the Messiah will be cut off and Jerusalem and the temple will be destroyed. So
That's referring to his separation from God at the moment of his death.
it's basically, when they say cut off, usually it means somebody's been killed. So, yeah, basically, saying at that point he's killed. Now we know he rose again, but that's fulfilling that part of the prophecy. And then the temple itself was destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans. Now the final week, the 70th week of years, has yet to happen. That has yet to be fulfilled. And nothing's going to happen there until the temple is rebuilt. And we're always seeing things, saying, oh, this is, coming to the end of days and etc. But so we don't really know when that's going to be. But if you start seeing the temple getting rebuilt, you better start paying attention. Because it's going to be somewhere in there. Periodically, you'll see, there's plans to rebuild the temple and etc. But I think as long as that mosque is sitting on top of Temple Mount, not going to happen for a while, and not without probably a lot of conflict, or something's going to have to happen before that temple's going to get rebuilt. And the final weeks, of years are related to the tribulation period, which we see, talked about in the book of Revelation, because it matches it. And then he actually even talks about, 3.5 in there, which is just like Revelation talks about. That halfway through the tribulation, things are going to change. So there's actually a lot of parallels between Daniel and Revelation. And then finally, the fourth vision that he had is this of the kings of the north and the south. Now this is another of those things that was really accurate in what he predicted. And this is where we get into this battle that we were talking about between the kind of the follow-on kingdoms from Alexander. First of all, this is where we hear about the angelic messenger that was sent, but the angel that was sent to give him the message got delayed by 20 some odd days because he got in a battle with a satanic spirit that wouldn't let him go through. I think they called him the Prince of Persia. And the archangel Michael actually had to get involved to allow this messenger angel to go through and complete his mission. And again, this, like I said, it pretty accurately describes the battles between the Seleucids and the kings that went by the name of Ptolemy. The north and the south is basically like Syria and Egypt if you're looking for the general geographic areas. The Seleucids were in the north, in the area of Syria and that area, and then the Ptolemies were down in Egypt. And they were battling back and forth. One would conquer each other, and they'd kind of move the lines back and forth as things went along. There's actually a kind of a short-term and a long-term fulfillment to this one, like there are a lot of prophecies that we saw, last session. We talk about, the desecration of the temple. Well, Antiochus Epiphanes desecrated the temple. But again, the Antichrist is also going to desecrate the rebuilt temple. And then the temple worship was restored after the defeat of Antiochus Epiphanes. That was basically, the temple then that Herod added on to. So it was like, then temple, Herod's temple at the time of Christ. And then Christ in his second coming is going to follow another restoration of the temple. So it's very, similar type things there. It's like you've got kind of the lesser fulfillment in the current times or the more recent times, and then the big time fulfillment when Christ comes. We've seen that in several of the prophecies that we've studied over the past months. And again, like I said, there's just a whole lot of parallels between Daniel and Revelation. And that's why when you get into really studying this, there are people that spend their whole careers studying nothing but the prophecies and the writings of Daniel, trying to figure out all the nuances and everything from it. It can really get involved. So owing to our somewhat limited time in this, and we have to kind of, like I say, keep it on a fairly 30,000 foot level, I guess that's what we're going to look at for Daniel right now, even though, like I said, we could spend forever on it. And we'll move on to the second book that we're going to be looking at here, which is the book of Lamentations. So this was written during, by Jeremiah during his stay in Jerusalem after the fall of Jerusalem. Basically, Nebuchadnezzar gave him a choice. He said, you can either come on up to Babylon or you can stay there. He chose to stay in Jerusalem and just see what was going on there and be there for the people that were still there. It's interesting that there's some parallel verses, between this book and Jeremiah. The book actually, called Jeremiah, since Jeremiah wrote both of them. And this book is actually read by the Jews on the 9th of Ab, another one of their months, which falls, July, August, to remember the date of the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. And just happens to be that's also the same date that Herod's temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. So that's one of the things that the Jews still read this book on this special occasion. This basically details Jeremiah's sorrow over the destruction of Jerusalem and the unrepentant sins of Israel, despite all the warnings that we'd seen, when we looked at all the warnings that Israel was given last semester by all these different prophets. Even up to the end, still trying, and Jeremiah is just, heartbroken basically over the fact that they didn't listen and the judgment finally fell on them, so much that he actually weeps over Jerusalem. And then later we see that Jesus, at one point in time when he's standing there looking at Jerusalem, he weeps too because he knows what's coming for Jerusalem. Just like Jeremiah, just so struck with sorrow over what was going on. And Jesus had the same reaction, knowing what's going to happen. That the temple's going to be destroyed, things they're going to be dispersed, and there's not going to be much of the going on in Israel until it's time for him to come back again. But despite all the doom and gloom that you see in Lamentation, it does end with a hopeful prayer, that's solid in the knowledge that God is going to restore Israel as he had promised. So despite all this gloom and doom, Jeremiah remembers the promises that God had made and knows that God is never going to break his promises. So he knows at some point in time it will be restored, but he just doesn't know exactly when or how. An interesting part about Lamentations is that it's acrostically arranged. Those of us that go to Saddleback know that Pastor Rick loves to use acrostics. Well, the Jews used it quite a bit too in their writings. So I put this in just as kind of like a little example. So it's the first, second, and fourth chapters. Each verse starts with the succeeding letter of the Hebrew alphabet, 22 basically. I think it's the third one, they do it in groups of threes. So there's 66 verses, I think, in that one, but three verses, each starting with the particular letter. And the fifth doesn't really follow it, but it's kind of close. So what we have over on the left side of this is that's the Hebrew alphabet. The other thing to remember about the Hebrew alphabet is, especially when you go back to the old Hebrew, is they only had consonants. They didn't have vowels. So these are all consonants that you see here. When you look over here, which, this is Lamentations 1, this is just the first 5 verses. Didn't want to clutter it up too much. But when you look over here, you'll see under these, you'll see some of these little marks. Those are vowel marks that were added in later so that people could figure out exactly what they were talking about here is, the Hebrew got a little bit less used. So if you study Hebrew today, they'll go through the consonants and they'll also go through the vowel marks so that it helps you figure out what it is.
My Hebrew's a little rusty, so I was wondering if you go, how do you read, right to left or left
It's
to right?
right to left.
Okay, I have another question. You said that verse 1 begins with the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, right?
Correct.
Okay, that first letter looks like, I don't know, kind of like a wiggly X. I don't see it over here.
Okay.
I don't see
Again,
it.
Hebrew's read from right to left. So the first letter in the
Okay, it
Hebrew
just looks
alphabet
different
is
there.
the Aleph,
Okay.
and
Oh,
so
I see.
that's
Yeah,
it
just
right
looks
there.
a little different. Well, my
Yeah.
eyes are all funky. Sorry.
It's you'll find a little bit of variation in the way different text and different fonts will show it. And there's also, if you actually see any handwritten, it's a little bit different there too, because it's hard to actually make some of these while doing handwritten. So if you'll see any handwritten Hebrew, it's a little bit different. And there are charts like this, that will show you what the handwritten version of it will look like. So anyway, yeah. So again, right to left. So this is the first letter in the first verse. So there's the Aleph, and there's the Beit. There's the Gimel. There's the Dalet, and there's the Hay. And it just keeps on going through all 22.
Okay, I can barely master English.
Those look like musical notes to me. The Hebrew alphabet,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of them look like musical notes.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because if you go to even a Messianic Jewish congregation, Messianic Jews are the ones that actually believe that Jesus is the Messiah. In fact, yeah. In fact, in our Saturday morning men's group, one of the guys that attends that on a regular basis, he actually is the cantor for a Messianic Jewish congregation that meets like over in, was it Mission Viejo, I think? Irvine, yeah. And so, yeah, he sometimes will kind of give us a little insight into what's going on. But the cantor's job is to essentially sing when they do this. So it's it is very musical, the way it's presented. So yeah, if you ever pick up, like I got this out of my Logos Bible software, where I picked up this version of the Hebrew Bible to put up here. If you ever look at a Hebrew Bible, you can just take a look at that and see it, see how that in Lamentations goes with each one of the separate, ones. If you just have a little chart somewhere.
After Jana does it, I'll do it.
Hey Tom, is it possible that Jeremiah and Daniel, because they both, Daniel was exiled to Babylon, but Jeremiah stayed. Possible that they knew each other, connection?
I think actually, I'm trying to remember some stuff I was reading, but I think Daniel is maybe even mentioned by Jeremiah. Because I know Daniel's mentioned several places along there, and I believe he is mentioned by Jeremiah. So yeah, they kind of knew at least knew about each other, how much they had, direct contact. But yeah, Daniel's mentioned in several different books in that time frame. So I guess we don't have a whole lot of time, but just maybe real quick for a quick discussion here. How have you heard the versions of Daniel explained? Have you ever heard any of this and heard various definitions or explanations of what's going on in Daniel? And there's some various objections that you might hear. Obviously one of them is for the people that don't believe that you can predict things in advance. Their big thing is, this was never written during that time. It had to be written, much, much, much later. So it was just, reciting what actually happened, not predicting what would happen. That's probably one of the big objections you'll hear. But I just wondered if you guys had heard anything from people you work with or serve with, or maybe you heard somebody else describing this. Or like I say, I know there are various people that go around, that will give lectures at different churches and such. that just concentrate, on the prophecies of Daniel, because there's just so much there.
It's a tough book. There's a lot to it. I struggle with trying to understand it.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot there, and like I said, you could probably spend, your whole career just studying it and trying to figure it out, and figure out how to explain it. That's the other part of it. Okay, well, I got a little suggestion I just kind of thought of as I was going through this, just in all the spare time you have, of course. But using the Bible, and if you can find maybe a couple of good references, just see if you can find the parallels between Daniel and Revelation. This is kind of a nice little exercise. We see obviously about the one about the final 7 weeks, both in Daniel and in Revelation. During the tribulation, and both of them mention that it's going to be split in half. That's kind of a place to get started, but just might be a kind of an interesting exercise, just if you can pick up some of the thing, because there's I saw one description. It said what Revelation is to the New Testament, Daniel is to the Old Testament, because like at the beginning we said they're both prophetic and apocalyptic books, in their format. And they're both, of course, eventually get around to dealing with the end times. So with that, I guess if there aren't any questions, we'll take a break and let Paul get set up for his.
Question, but I can't remember where I read it. This really stinks. Turn off the mic. I don't want the rest of the world to know about that right now.
Forever.